A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
On Tisha B'Av in the Shmona Esrei, we say an expanded version of the bracha Bonei Yerushalayim. The nusach that is printed in most Sidurim describes Jerusalem as being desolate and without inhabitants, and this despite the fact that many hundreds of thousands of Jews reside here in Jerusalem. Should one nevertheless use the nusach that is printed in most Sidurim, and if not, what should one do?
There are in fact a number of reasons why one should not use the nusach that appears in most Sidurim, but rather use a different nusach, as I will explain. Not only for the reason that you mentioned, although that is also a very valid reason, but also for other reasons. So let us begin at the beginning. The first thing to know is that the requirement to add something or to expand part of the tefillah of the Shmona Esrei on Tisha B'Av is not mentioned in the Talmud Bavli at all. It is mentioned in the Talmud Yerushalmi, as we shall explain, but in the Talmud Bavli it is not mentioned at all. And this indicates clearly that the original practice in Bavel and the environs, going back to the Talmudic period and also apparently for a few centuries after the Talmudic period, so we're talking about the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, the 9th centuries, apparently, the practice was not to say anything special with regards to Tisha B'Av. The only source that we have in Chazal for changing any part of the tefillah or adding something to the tefillah on Tisha B'Av appears in the Talmud Yerushalmi, both in Masechet Berachot and in Masechet Ta'niot. The same information, the same statement appears in both places, and what we find there is also quoted by the Rif. The Rif at the end of Masechet Ta'niot, in the pages of the Rif, it is on page Yod, Daf Yod Amud Aleph, he quotes as follows: Yerushalmi, in other words, I am now quoting from the Talmud Yerushalmi, that's what the Rif means to tell you, and he's quoting from the Talmud Yerushalmi for the reason that we just explained, because there is no parallel source in the Talmud Bavli. However, by the time the Rif is writing his Sefer Halachot, approximately 1,000 years ago, it was already standard practice throughout the Jewish world to add this tefillah on Tisha B'Av. So he must quote it from the only source that exists, which is the Yerushalmi. So he writes, Yerushalmi, Rabbi Aha Omer, Yahid b'Tisha B'Av, the individual on Tisha B'Av, Sarich Lazkir Ma'in HaMe'orah. In other words, even the individual, when doing his own silent Shmona Esrei, is required to mention the fact that today is Tisha B'Av and to mention the reason for this day being commemorated. Umay Nihu, what is this tefillah that he must say? Now what we have in the Rif before us reads as follows: Nachem Adonai Eloheinu alenu v'al Yisrael amecha v'al Yerushalayim yirecha, etc., etc. And he doesn't bring the entire nusach, which does appear in the Yerushalmi. He just brings the beginning of it. Now I want you to take note of what we see here. The word beneath my finger is Nachem with a nun. Nachem, which means to comfort. The problem with the language quoted by the Rif is that in Hebrew you cannot possibly say Nachem Adonai Eloheinu alenu v'al Yisrael amecha. Now the word Nachem, meaning to comfort, must be followed according to Hebrew grammar by the expression Nachem Avilet Zion, or Nachem Yisrael amecha, or Nachem et Yisrael amecha, or something like that. But you cannot be Nachem al. You can be the Rachem al someone. You can take mercy, have mercy on someone. That takes the preposition al. But to lenachem, to comfort, as opposed to lerachem with a resh, lenachem with a nun, has to be followed by either an et or just the object. In other words, comfort the Jewish people, Nachem Amecha Yisrael, or something like that. It's clear from the language that the Rif has been tampered with. The Lashon of the Rif has been tampered with. It's clear both for the grammatical reason that I point out. It's also clear because the Rif is quoting from the Talmud Yerushalmi. And in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the statement does not begin with the word Nachem with a nun, but rather with the word Rachem with a resh, which is of course logically followed by Rachem al Yisrael Amecha, etc. And the Rif is quoting from the Yerushalmi, so he must be quoting what the Yerushalmi says and not something else. It is therefore clear that in the printings of the Rif before us, a small change was made. The resh of Rachem was changed, was modified to become a nun, and therefore read as Nachem. When was this done? I cannot be certain, but I do know that already in the first printing of the Rif 500 odd years ago plus, this was already the case. So it was obviously done a long time ago. And this was done in order to make it fit the nusach that it appears in most Sidurim, which begins with the word Nachem. And quite fittingly, if you do begin with Nachem, then you follow with something like Nachem et Amecha Yisrael, or et Avelet Sion, or something along those lines. So we have here the text of the Rif which has been tampered with. And the same exact thing, one can have no doubt, I believe, happened with regards to the Rosh. In the Rosh as well, already in the first printing of the Rosh from Venice in 1520, Shnat Resh Peh, the Rosh too quotes the Yerushalmi as it were, but the wording he brings is not the text of the Yerushalmi, but the text which is found in most Sidurim nowadays. In other words, there not only one letter was changed from Rachem to Nachem, but rather the first few words were changed in order to make it fit that which is found in the Sidurim. The reason behind these changes was simply to make the text of the Rif or the Rosh fit with the common practice, and this is not something unusual. It shouldn't really surprise us. But there is no doubt that the original text of the Yerushalmi, as we have it in the all the printed versions of the Yerushalmi from the first printing onwards, and all the manuscripts of the Yerushalmi, begins with the word Rachem and continues to say Rachem al Yis'alenu, al Yis'alamecha, al Yerushalmi Recha, etc. In other words, very similar to the nusach that we have in Birkat Hamazon, for example, which is another indication of an ancient nusach, the modular style of the nusach, which can be used in Birkat Hamazon or in Tefillah or in some other place in the Sidur. This is one of the obvious characteristics which we see in many of the tefillot from ancient times. Furthermore, the statement of the Rif that we add this tefillah on Tisha B'Av does not make any mention of the fact that it should be said only during the tefillah of Minha, but rather the clear implication is that it should be said throughout the day of Tisha B'Av, that is to say, both in Arvith and in Shaharith, and also, of course, in Minha. And this is not only the implication of the Rosh, but in fact the Rosh goes further and goes on to say that I've always been surprised and amazed, writes the Rosh in his own words, that many people have the practice of saying this tefillah only during Mincha, when it is clear it should be said for all the tefillot of Tisha B'Av. And this is not just a preferable halachic stance, this is the actual chovah, this is the requirement, because the Yerushalmi, which is the source of this entire halakha, this is an example of a halakha that began in Eretz Yisrael and was eventually accepted by the entire Jewish world, including in Bavel. The statement in the Talmud Yerushalmi is that the Yahid, Sarich Lazkir, the individual, even the individual, that is to say, of course also the Shlech Tzibur, the person leading the minyan, must also do so, but the implication and the stress is laid on the fact that even an individual who prays by himself on Tisha B'Av is required to make this, recite this special tefillah during his Shmona Esrei. This tefillah is a chovah and must be said during all the tefillot of the day, just as on Rosh Chodesh we say Ya'aleh V'Yavo during all the tefillot, Arvith, Shaharith, Mincha, just as we say Ya'aleh V'Yavo on Chol HaMoed or Yom Tov, just as we say Al Nisim during all the tefillot on Hanukkah, Purim, etc. So there is no question that this is the position of the Rif, and this is exactly what the Rosh states very explicitly. This is also quoted by his son, the Tur, in Siman Tav Chof Nun Zayin. And this is also the clear intention of the Rambam. Now I'll quote to you the Rambam just to clarify the point. In Rambam's Mishneh Torah Perek Bev Halacha Yod Daled or Tet Zayin, depending on one's edition, Rambam writes, Tisha B'Av Mosifim B'Vonei Yerushalayim, one adds into the bracha B'Vonei Yerushalayim, Rachem Adonai Eloheinu Aleinu V'al Yisrael Amecha V'al Yerushalayim Yorecha, etc. Here the Rambam only mentions the Nusach briefly, but at the end of Sefer Ahava, where he brings all the Nusach of the Tefillah, there he mentions the entire Nusach that one adds on Tisha B'Av, and it begins with Rachem, as we just said, and it is more or less exactly the Nusach of the Yerushalmi, and this is true for all the ancient sources, by the way. I'll show you, for example, the Nusach that we find in Sidur Rav Amram Gaon, Seder Rav Amram Gaon. Here one can see the Nusach that is quoted by Rav Amram Gaon begins with Rachem. It is also very close to the Nusach of the Yerushalmi, and it is very different from the Nusach which appears in most Sidurim. The same is true for the Sidur of Rav Sa'adia Gaon, etc., etc. In almost all the Rishonim, the Ramban, or the Nun, also in Torah Ha'adam and the Ritba, and in all sources basically, we find this Nusach which begins with Rachem, Al Yisrael Amecha, and it is basically loosely based, or very closely based in most cases, on the Nusach of the Yerushalmi. It is only in the Or Zarua that I have found a source which quotes the following. It says there, and this is also appears in the Tur, which comes after the Or Zarua, in the name of Rabbi David Bar-Hayim, that in the Or Zarua is brought the name of certain anonymous Geonim, that one says Rachem during Arvith and Shaharith, and in the afternoon one says Nachem. The logic there being explained is that in the evening, and in the morning one is like a mourner before he buries his dead, and in the afternoon one is like a mourner who has already buried his dead and is now in a state where he can receive Nehama, he can receive Nihum Avelim. So we say Nahamenu or Nahem instead of Rachem. This is an interesting svara perhaps, but it is unclear where this Nusach comes from, the Nusach of Nachem. It is entirely unclear who invented it, and it clearly is not the Nusach that appears in the Yerushalmi. So when faced with a text which appears in the Yerushalmi, which is quoted by all the ancient sources, and which is a chova to recite according to the Talmud Yerushalmi and according to all these poskim that we've mentioned, one is surprised that anyone would have thought of replacing with another Nusach. That is the first and foremost reason to prefer this Nusach of Rachem over any other Nusach. The other reason, as you mentioned, is the fact that the Nusach that appears in most Sidurim, the Nusach that begins with the word Nachem, is very explicit in describing Yerushalayim in terms which simply cannot be reconciled today with the reality. I will quote just for a moment to make the point clear. The Nusach here, this is a standard Nusach Ashkenaz Sidur I have in front of me, speaks about comforting Avelet Zion and Avelet Yerushalayim, and it speaks about the ear, the city, Ha'ir, Ha'avela, Ha'hareva, Ha'bezuya, Ha'shomema, and then it goes on to explain what it means. It says, Ha'shomema me'en yoshev, for example, the city which is desolate without inhabitants. Ha'avela mi bari baneha, the city which is in mourning without its children. This, despite the fact that there are in Yerushalayim today many hundreds of thousands of Jews. It is a thriving and bustling city, and it's difficult to see how one can make such statements at the present time, particularly after the Six-Day War. And this is why a number of Chachamim over the years have mentioned this issue, have come up against this issue, and made certain suggestions to avoid making statements in our tefillot which are clearly factually not true, and which in fact are lies. And that's a very serious thing, to speak before Hashem and to speak something which is not true. I have here, for example, a card which I found in one Tisha B'Av at the Kotel many years ago, possibly 30 or more years ago. This is a nusach that was put out by Rav Goren, a Gaon Rav Shlomo Goren Zal, after the Six-Day War, also based to a large extent on the Yerushalmi and the Rishonim. Another great Chacham who was asked on more than one occasion what to do about this nusach was Rabbi David Halevi. We have here the book put out, the book by Rabbi David Halevi called Asel Harav, and in the first volume, Siman Yudar, the Teshuvah or response number 14, he writes that yes, indeed, you have a good point. Someone asks him this question. He says you are entirely right. It's impossible to say this nusach as before. And his suggestion is to speak about Yerushalayim Hayatha Hareva and Bizuya, that was once in such a state. Yerushalayim was once such and such, and without its children, in Hiyasheva B'Rosha Hafuyla, it used to be in this state, and then to go on to ask for the more complete Geula and redemption. My problem with this solution, with the suggestion, is that what we say in Tefillah should not be a description of historical facts, unless, of course, we're thanking Hashem for something that happened and is now over, such as Aranisim for Purim, for Hanukkah. There we relate what happened, and that's the end of it. We thank Hashem for what was, and we're not asking for anything with regards to the future in connection to that event. But here, with regards to the Mikdash and everything that goes with it, here we are talking about the present situation, which is lacking. If we only speak about what was, then we're not really describing fully what is today. And therefore, many years ago, I published a version of this tefillah, which is essentially the text of the Talmud Yerushalmi, almost word for word, as quoted also by almost all the Rishonim that we mentioned, the Rif, and the Rosh, and the Rambam, and Rosh Adia, and Avraham Gaon, and the Ramban, and the Ritba, etc., etc. The nusach which appears in about 20 or more Rishonim. And the only change that I made was, instead of referring to the city, it refers to Makom HaMikdash and the Har, the mountain, the Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount. About 25 years ago or so, I published this little card which explains why it is incorrect to continue saying the nusach that appears in many Sidurim. And after the explanation of the matter, as it appears here on the back, we have the nusach which is based entirely on the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Rishonim, with a very minor change that instead of speaking about the city, it speaks about the Temple Mount. In other words, here we see the words Al Makom Beth Mikdashecha, speaks about Har HaAvel, the mountain, the Temple Mount, which is in mourning, etc., etc. And this is, of course, what we're davening for nowadays on Tisha B'Av, because if the Mikdash were rebuilt, we would no longer be commemorating Tisha B'Av. So, for all the above reasons, the correct nusach to say on Tisha B'Av is not the nusach which appears in most Sidurim. The correct nusach that one should say is that which is brought in the Talmud Yerushalmi and all the Rishonim, with the very minor modification that we have mentioned.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.